This is going to be counting down the 12 worst controllers. Now, I don't necessarily hate any of these controllers, aside from maybe the Xbox Kinect, but these last 12 aren't quite as good as the rest. Now, in 39th place, as well as 40th place, we have the Joy-Cons on their side again, but this time with the grips that are included along with the Nintendo Switch bundle. As before, I still prefer the left slightly more, thus it's getting 39th as opposed to the right, which is getting 40th. This definitely adds a lot more to the controller, and it makes it feel a lot more solid than just the standard Joy-Con, and the triggers, and the SL and SR buttons definitely are a lot easier to press. My biggest complaint with this, though, is that really any way you hold it, your finger is still like brushing over or resting on this wire here, which is used for the wrist strap. Now, I'm definitely in favor of the wrist strap being there as opposed to it not being there, but the way that it's placed there, it really feels like there's no good way to hold it, because it'll always be on one side where your finger is being used to hold it. And in 41st and 42nd place, we have, same as before, but without those rails on it. Now, although this slightly fixes the issue I had with the cord getting in the way of your grip of the controller, it now adds in little points on the controller, which I find significantly worse than having to deal with that cable. It also makes the SL and SR buttons, although they're still easy enough to press, it's a lot more of a struggle than you'll find on really any other controller. It's a bit unusual, and honestly, it doesn't even feel like there's buttons there without some sort of added texture to them. In 43rd place, we have the Sega Genesis controller. Now, I never actually had one of these until recently, but what I can definitely say about it is I am a fan of this ABC layout. It looks pretty unusual by today's standards, but I still think it's pretty good. D-pad, I'm not a big fan of. It definitely looks like a D-pad, but it just feels like a really cheap kind of knockoff, especially compared to the NES, which was the competition when this first came out. The thing is, the hand grip on this is still decent enough. It's a pretty large controller, especially compared to what I thought it would look like prior to actually having one. And although, as far as I can tell, there was no controllers with triggers or bumper buttons at the time, it just feels very off. Like, the Super Nintendo controller still feels like it would be a good controller without them. The Genesis, it just keeps feeling to me like there's something missing, because there's no bumpers or triggers. Granted, there was no bumpers or triggers around or mainstream when the controller came out, but it's just something that seems really unusual to me about the controller. Now, this is another one of those ones that will have people very divided about it being so low on the list, but we have the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con Grip. Now, this isn't the independent Joy-Cons, this isn't the Joy-Cons on their side, this isn't on the console or the Pro controller. This is in the grip that's supposed to make the Joy-Cons feel like a normal controller. The thing is, it doesn't work that well. The rounded edge on the bottom here is always going to be hitting kind of the base of your thumb, which gets very uncomfortable very quickly. The right analog stick being low is most apparent in this style of holding the controller, and really you can't even hit the face buttons without hitting the right analog stick with the side of your thumb, which is really annoying. The back side of it feels really unusual. Although they have a curve to make it connect as well as feel a bit more textured, it's really unusual. Also, these grips on the back, although they look like they'd be really substantial, they're incredibly tiny in your hand. They don't even fit in your palm, and they don't even fill all of your fingers to hold it. So it just feels like a really cheap, uncomfortable controller, even though it's like one of the newest controllers out there. Now in 45th place, we have the Nyko, or the Nico, however you want to call it, I'll call it Nyko, Pro controller. This is for the Wii U, and when I first got it, I was a big fan. Although when I first got it, I had smaller hands, and Now that I've got larger hands, I find this to be a very uncomfortable controller. The grips on the back, they try to shape to hands, but for me they really don't do the trick. And your fingertips are always hitting right flat on this back here, which I find to be a bit uncomfortable. I really don't like how there's this pointed curve on the bottom here, because it feels like your finger should be right on that point, but then it doesn't feel like they should be there, and it just is really unusual to hold. Although the analog sticks, D-pad, buttons, triggers, and all that feel just fine, I keep having this issue. If my left analog stick goes to the side, it just stays there. These analog sticks don't do a very good job of centering back to the middle, and they can stick very easily. And I've used more than one of these controllers, and it seems to be a reoccurring theme with them that the analog sticks will get stuck. And it's just not something I'm as big of a fan of. The material it's made out of is pretty unusual. It's kind of a weird thin rubber, it feels like. Overall, maybe it's better if you have smaller hands, but I can't seem to get the hang of this controller. Now in 46th place, possibly the most hated choice on this entire list, get ready for it, the NES controller. Now this one is a classic. People grew up with this controller. They played all these great games during their childhood with this controller. They were so happy to get the chance to do it. All those memories are software. Those are games you're playing. That's not the controller. This controller, it was revolutionary. It had a great D-pad, and the buttons are great, but it had really pointy edges. It was super tiny, nothing for your palms. It didn't even really wrap with your fingers. And although this might work for little kids, I really am not a fan of it. All the buttons are really good buttons on there, but just the overall shape of the controller really brings it down for me. It doesn't fit comfortably in my hand really any way I hold it because of the pointed corners and how tiny it is. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't stand the test of time, especially given the competition that has come out since then. Now in 47th place, we have the original Game Boy Advance. I do not have an SP. I want one, but I don't have one. Now this, to me, similar to the NES controller, it feels very pointy. Like, I don't really like it. It has some unusual curvature, because on every other controller, you're used to it being wider where your fingers are, and then thinner in the back, and it's completely flipped on here. The buttons feel a little bit too low to me. Granted, a lot of the problems I have with this are probably due to this being for people with smaller hands in most cases. The D-pad, I feel, although it's trying, it doesn't even hold up to something like the D-pad on the GameCube controller, which I am much more a fan of. The trigger buttons on here are pretty unusual. The area where your thumb finger is meant to land on just feels like it's in an odd place. A lot about this is really good for the time and really good for what they were going for and who they were aiming at and the size hands they were typically expecting to be using this, but for me specifically, this just feels uncomfortable, tiny, pointy, and like the buttons are a bit cheaply made. Now in 48th place, to many this will be the last thing that really makes sense on the list as a controller, and that is the Sega Dreamcast controller. Now, prior to holding it, this looked like a very good controller to me. I did not see any issues with it really at all. I was like, okay, I guess they don't have a second analog stick, but for the time, that's fine. I mean, the original Xbox wasn't even out yet. A lot of people would complain about the cord coming out the bottom. It's never been something that bothered me because I got an extension cord for it. But what really bothers me is these grips that your fingers are meant to go on. Although it fits in your palm, kind of, like that, the grip here is so narrow, and it just feels uncomfortable for your fingers to grip around something that's so pointy and thin. But then anytime they want to stretch it all, the VMU storage, or whatever it's called here, is taking up all that space. So it's just very unusually designed, and it feels like a very cramped controller. This is definitely the controller that I would probably get the most hand cramps from using. I'm not a big fan of the buttons as much. They feel like they're kind of in a weird place. Start button is probably the only button on here that I can really say, hey, that's a good button. But everything else feels really unusual, spaced out, shaped. The analog stick, it is really bad. I'd put it below the N64 analog stick, which is not the best analog stick, but I'd put this quite a bit below that one even. The D-pad, I don't know how they screwed this up. This is the worst D-pad by such a large margin. It is very uncomfortable to use. It has almost no give. It just feels like you're breaking it if you're moving it at all. There's no feedback at all. It is just like a weird little flimsy thing. Like basically on the new Nintendo 3DS and the new Nintendo 3DS XL, you know that little nub they have for the right analog stick? Try making that like 3 times as worse and as big as a D-pad. That's basically what you get with this. It just doesn't feel like it's built the way that it should be. And that's my thoughts on the Sega Dreamcast controller. In 49th and second to last place, we have... Wait, where'd I put it? The Retron 5 controller. Now, not everyone knows what the Retron series is, but the Retron 5 is the one I happen to pick up because you can play all the Game Boy games as well, from Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. But that's besides the point. Luckily, the console has ports on it so you can use things like the NES, the SNES, and the Genesis controller. But the controller it comes with, although wireless, and that's great considering what types of consoles you're playing on it, it's not a good controller. I don't know what they did with this, but I mean, like every calculator I've ever used has better buttons than this thing. It has such a terrible analog stick. It's so clicky, it's so loud, it's so uncomfortable. Everything is so harshly shaped and cornered off. It's not a comfortable controller to hold. It is so lightweight. Like, even the SNES or the NES controller are like way heavier, like double the weight of this thing. It feels like it's just hollow and the buttons have no give to them. It makes super annoying noises. The triggers don't even feel like there's anything there, which might be a good thing, but it really isn't the way that I've experienced this. It is an incredibly underwhelming controller. Analog stick for sure is the worst part, because pretty much every game you're going to be playing on this, actually literally every game you could play on this, is from a console that had a D-pad or was trying to have a D-pad on it. And they gave you this really weird clicky analog stick thing with no feedback that feels like it's grinding against the board in the back here just to move. It's an abomination. I hate this controller, and I never want to use it again. In 50th place, and the last place of all the controllers that I've decided are worth putting on this list, we actually have a double selection. Now this is again a personal preference, but I am not a fan of just touchscreen gaming. I've tried a couple different genres of games, from platformers to, well, like from platformers to press one button or whatever type games, but I am not a fan of these. It's not something for me, and I'm really not ever enjoying myself trying to play a game on either of these. Particularly mobile, I would say, is the worst, because the screen feels way too tiny, and then your finger ends up blocking a lot of what you're trying to see on there. It's really not something I enjoy the experience of. Tablet, I'm sure, is better. I haven't played a game on a tablet before. This is a tablet that wouldn't really be able to play games. It's just a school typing tablet. But it's not something I would want to play games on, especially if I had the choice. It's something that feels really unusual to me, and I really like having the tactile feedback of a traditional controller as opposed to a touchscreen. So that was ranking all 50 of my controllers from my absolute least favorite to my favorite controllers of all times, as well as throwing in a couple variants and additional ones that didn't quite make the cut for this list. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know what controllers you really love or really hate down in the comments section below. Till then, see ya!